In the fall of 1956, the world was on the brink of a major international conflict. America's allies, Britain and France, were engaged in a battle against Egypt over control of the Suez Canal. The Soviet Union was threatening to intervene on the side of Egypt. America wanted to avoid military action at any cost and demanded that the British and French allies withdraw from the region. When their request was denied, the U.S. turned to financial warfare. America, which at that time owned much of England's debt, threatened to sell off or dump a significant part of its holdings in the British pound. This would have effectively destroyed England's currency. The result? All British and French military forces withdrew from the Suez region within weeks.
If 15 or 20 years from now, 2 or 3% of the GDP is being paid abroad merely to service the debts or the ownership of assets that have been incurred because we're over-consuming, that will be politically unstable.
While it can't be measured in dollar terms, our leadership deficit is our nation's biggest challenge. Too many of our current leaders know we are facing a financial crisis, yet they lack the courage to do something about it.
States and our allies have prevailed.
President Bush 43 asked me to come back to the government and be the Secretary of the Treasury, which I did for 23 months before I got fired for having a difference of opinion.
For the record, the White House is saying that Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill and top economic advisor Larry Lindsey tendered their resignations voluntarily.
The Vice President said, the President's decided to make some changes, and you're one of the changes. And what we'd like to do is have you come over and meet with the President and basically say that you've decided to go back to the private sector. You know, for me to say that I've decided to leave the Treasury is a lie, and I'm not into doing lies, and so that was it. I went back to my office, latched up my briefcase, and went down to the parking space that's reserved for the Secretary of the Treasury, got in my car, and drove back to Pittsburgh. Well, you know, it's a first in my life. I'd never been fired before. I'd only been promoted to ever higher levels of responsibility. But, you know, it was okay with me because I would have really been uncomfortable arguing for policies I didn't believe in. I argued during the second half of 2002 we should not have another tax cut. That was not a popular view. And in fact, it led to a conversation with the Vice President where he basically told me that we don't have to worry about deficits. which I got to tell you was really a shock to me. When the Bush 43 administration took over, we had something over maybe $5.6 trillion worth of national debt. Today, I think the number is $8.8 trillion. That's not an innocent change. It is a monumental change in the debt service that we have to do, in addition to and on top of all of the other things that our country needs to do. I think we only need to look at the fate of other countries who've lived beyond their means for a long time. You inevitably get into trouble. When you get extended to the point that you can't service your debt, you're finished.
Some people think that we can solve our financial problems by stopping fraud, waste, and abuse, or by canceling the Bush tax cuts, or by ending the war in Iraq. The truth is, we could do all three of these things, and we would not come close to solving our nation's fiscal challenges. Here's how bad our situation really is. We already have approximately $11 trillion in total liabilities, including public debt. To this amount, you need to add the current unfunded obligations for Social Security benefits of about $7 trillion. Then add Medicare's unfunded promises, $34 trillion, of which about $26 trillion relates to Medicare Parts A and B, and about $8 trillion relates to Medicare Part D, the new prescription drug benefit, which some claimed would save money in overall Medicare costs. Add another $1 trillion in miscellaneous items, and you get $53 trillion. Our country would need $53 trillion invested today, which is about $175,000 per person, to deliver on the government's obligations and promises. How much of this $53 trillion do we have? Zip. By the time today's college graduates are ready to retire, 40 years from now, the only things our government will be able to pay for are interest on the federal debt and some Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid benefits. All other parts of the federal government will be closed and out of business. What about taxes? We would have to raise federal tax burdens across the board, more than 2 times today's levels, to close the financing gap. Some politicians complain when any tax increases are mentioned. We're facing a more than doubling of federal taxes if we continue down our present path. Remember our debt to GDP? By the year 2040, our debt to GDP will be twice the record level at the end of World War II, and it skyrockets after that. Who's going to lend us money then?